Theme parks are of course fantastic vessels for bringing fantasy to life. Disney's castle parks are defined by Fantasyland, the Wizarding World has become immensely popular for Universal, and there are even entire parks themed to fantasy, like with Efteling. Fantasy-themed lands and attractions have become standard all over the world, but what's really perplexing is how out of all the intellectual property that could be chosen, The Wizard of Oz has surprisingly not been represented on a grand scale. This isn't to say that it hasn't been represented at all, because it's definitely had attractions and even an entire small theme park built around it, but it hasn't really had any extensive representation at the top levels of the industry. Other than a brief scene in The Great Movie Ride, Disney has never tackled this world, and while Universal Studios Japan did actually have a small Oz-themed mini-land, it was short-lived and not very popular. What made me interested in exploring Oz as a theme park concept was actually the recent release of Wicked, as Universal Studios Florida promoted the movie through a themed store. If you watch my videos on the regular, then you know that I've been a very big fan of Universal's tribute stores, which celebrate Halloween Horror Nights, various holidays, and blockbuster films as these highly themed experiences that are essentially walk-through attractions. When Universal announced that the Wicked store would be a themed experience, well, I was immediately interested, even though I know very little about the novel or the musical. Walking in, half the store is essentially a showcase of props and costumes from the film, and people can meet and take pictures with entertainment portraying Elphaba and Glinda. The other half is a themed store that continues promoting the film, but while it's not as detailed as the tribute stores, I would still consider it an intriguing, well-themed experience, showing that an actual Oz attraction might have a lot of potential. In fact, with the renewed interest, I've seen a lot of people posting the idea online that Oz would make for a great theme park land. This idea seemed like a good opportunity to dive into the really interesting history of failed and demolished Wizard of Oz attractions, which for the most part have not set a great precedent. However, I think that with the right company and budget, an attraction or even entire land could be wildly successful, and so today, I also wanted to explore that possibility. Hey there! If you would like to support the video, please do me a favor and leave a like, and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. But before diving into the history of Wizard of Oz attractions, I think it's important to clarify what this IP actually is. The original novel in the series, titled as The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, was published by L. Frank Baum in 1900 and was quite successful financially. In addition to citing inspiration from many European fairy tales, Baum was also influenced by Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which in my opinion is definitely reflected in the absurdity of the characters that he created. Baum had essentially penned a new popular fairy tale, but one that feels distinctly American and reflects the politics, culture, and imagery of its time. Due to his other novels flopping and popular demand for more from the world of Oz, Baum continued writing entries into the series until he passed in 1919. As with any popular book, Hollywood was interested in adapting the stories into films, and while there were quite a few adaptations that have mostly been forgotten, it was the famous 1939 MGM musical, titled as The Wizard of Oz, that has set the standard for what most people know about this world. While it takes its own creative liberties in adapting the story, so it's not the most faithful, it still established core characters like Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion, the Wizard of Oz himself, and of course Glinda the Good Witch of the North and the iconic Wicked Witch of the West. Ironically, the movie lost money at the box office through its absurd production costs, which resulted from its expensive special effects and troubled set production, but through decades of re-releases in theaters and exposure on television, this film became a classic known to almost every American household in the 20th century. In 1954, Disney bought the rights to the remaining novels in the Oz series, which were to be adapted for the Disneyland show, which never occurred, but later was also written as a film, The Rainbow Road to Oz, which also failed to make it to production. This attempt at adapting the novels makes sense to me, as the material does feel very fitting for the Disney brand of films at the time, but after sitting on the rights for decades, a new film was eventually released in 1985, known as Return to Oz. Taking inspiration from many elements throughout the books, this unofficial sequel to the MGM classic is a shocking contrast to the upbeat musical of the 1930s. This strange, creepy world fits in alongside other dark fantasy kids movies of the 80s, and while it wasn't received well at the time, it's now generally considered a cult classic. I actually find the world building here a lot more interesting than the MGM film, because while most people only know those characters, Return to Oz shows that this world is much bigger, and that's what gives it a theme park land worth of potential. Disney would try and fail again to create another film with 2013's Oz the Great and Powerful, which was quickly forgotten as boring CGI slop, but it appears that Universal's 2024 adaptation of Wicked is the latest film to actually have relevance. Granted, this story was published in 1995 as Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West by Gregory Maguire, and despite its popularity, I have to point out that it's fan fiction rather than canon to the series. However, its 2003 adaptation into a Broadway musical was wildly popular, and has obviously resulted in the film and a renewed interest in the world of Oz, showing that these stories and characters can adapt to maintain relevance and easily belong in upper-tier theme parks. With this brief bit of context covered though, let's actually take a look into the history of how this IP has been implemented. In 1957, an attraction known as Tweetsie Railroad opened in Blowing Rock, North Carolina, which transported riders on a classic steam locomotive which was built and put into service in 1917. However, after its retirement, it was eventually acquired by a man named Grover Robbins, who along with his brothers Harry and Spencer, began to run the locomotive as a paid attraction. Quickly, a western town was built around the station, turning this experience into a small western theme park. But when Grover and Harry began to pursue a new business venture, they purchased a nearby ski resort at Beech Mountain, North Carolina. Located just a little over 20 miles from Tweetsie Railroad, they didn't know what to do with the site, but in 1965, they hired Jack Pentes, who, as a designer from Charlotte, suggested that the landscape of the mountaintop reminded him of the location from The Wizard of Oz. This idea quickly developed into a Wizard of Oz theme park, and opening in 1970, it was immediately successful, averaging about 450,000 guests for its first 3 seasons. The park was essentially a walkthrough attraction, where you took on the role of Dorothy, encountering your destroyed farmhouse and following the Yellow Brick Road. This ambitious structure was made up of 44,000 glazed bricks, and as you made your way along, you would encounter many of the iconic characters from The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which had entered the public domain in 1956. At the end, there was the Emerald City Amphitheater, where Dorothy and her companions would act out meeting the wizard, and a modified ski lift was fitted with balloons, which a separate hidden actress dressed as Dorothy would ride to conclude the show. While the content of the park was based on what was available in the public domain, the park still had a connection to the MGM film, as there was a building that worked as a museum for props and costumes acquired from an auction. However, the park began to struggle at the beginning of the 1973 oil crisis, and in December of 1975, the theater and adjacent offices and gift shop were set on fire, which appeared to be a distraction as memorabilia from the museum was stolen and hasn't been found since. The park reopened in 1976 under a new owner, but as quality diminished and visitation dropped, it closed in 1981, which now in an abandoned state, was plagued with vandalism. Later, in 1988, a small reunion of former park employees occurred, which sparked the idea of reopening for a limited period of time. By 1993, the park reopened in autumn in a restored state, and since that point, the park has continued seasonal operation. While today, the park looks interesting, and I would certainly like to visit, I don't think that it really lives up to the idea of Oz as a grand, fantastical world that a company like Disney or Universal could pull off. It's not to say that it doesn't have its own unique charm, which I'm sure many people love, but while it may be an entire Wizard of Oz theme park that still continues operation, it's still relatively unknown outside of the online theme park community or among locals of North Carolina. However, if you wanted to experience something far more grand and flashy, then it was Las Vegas of all places that offered a really interesting Wizard of Oz experience. I've already covered this in my extensive themed entertainment was better in the 90s video, but to reiterate, among the boom of themed mega resorts as the Vegas Strip pivoted towards family entertainment, the MGM Grand opened in December of 1993 as the largest hotel in the world at the time, containing over 5,000 rooms. The structure's 30-story towers were designed to reflect an emerald green, obviously to evoke the idea of the Emerald City, and the entrance to the casino on the Strip had tourists walk through the paws of the MGM Lion. Entering inside though, patrons would encounter a massive structure of the Emerald City, which had Dorothy and her companions posed in front as they walked the yellow brick road. This scene was framed by a 7-story high domed ceiling, where you could see the Wizard of Oz in his balloon, and projections on the dome enhanced the sky with clouds and stars. Inside the Emerald City was an attraction, where after purchasing tickets, you walked through scenes from the film as animated figures depicting the characters moved and emitted dialogue as you waded through what was just a really well-themed queue. Once it was time to enter the Emerald City, patrons moved through the doors into a small theater, where sitting down, they watched a magic show that, to my knowledge, had nothing to do with the Wizard of Oz, but was still generally well regarded. Outside of the Emerald City, the casino floor and buffet were decorated decadently to portray the Land of Oz, and nestled among the machines, an animated figure of Glinda would move and emit audio, just like the figures in the attraction at Emerald City. Unfortunately, Las Vegas learned quickly that family entertainment and gambling did not mix, and by 1996, the Wizard of Oz theming was completely demolished and replaced with more slot machines, with gaming revenue rising significantly with this change. I'm disappointed that this lasted for only such a brief period of time, but as with most theming in Vegas, it was more flash than actual substance, so I'm not surprised that it wasn't drawing people in. Still, while it wasn't the most immersive Oz attraction to have been built, it was still a great tribute to the MGM film, considering the location that it was built for. If you wanted to be truly immersed into the MGM version of The Wizard of Oz, then I think that your best opportunity was to have experienced the Great Movie Ride. Opening with Disney MGM Studios in 1989, the ride anchored the park and worked as a thesis statement, celebrating classic genre-defining films that built Hollywood. Towards the end of the attraction, riders moved through a scene that depicted Fantasia, where the vehicle curved around a screen that showed Mickey using sorcery with the power of the wizard's hat. With the framing of the screen and the powerful fans that blow throughout this room, it clearly reveals that this was originally intended to be a tornado scene from The Wizard of Oz, although reportedly, the expensive licensing fees from MGM were determined for the ride minute by minute, which resulted in this being retrofitted into Fantasia to save on cost. Still, I can imagine Dorothy's farmhouse spinning in the wind, and emerging out, riders found themselves in the Land of Oz, where traveling through Munchkin Land, they witnessed the ruby slippers on the feet of the Wicked Witch of the East. Continuing further, the Munchkins emerge out from hiding, and begin to belt out the celebratory "Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead" as the vehicle winds through the village. This was the largest, grandest scene of the Great Movie Ride, and contained many animatronics to put you directly into the film. As they reach the finale of the song, the ride vehicles stop and heavy smoke would begin to emit out from a raised platform. Turning red and emitting a loud boom, the Munchkins scream and retreat into hiding as the Wicked Witch of the West manifests, repeating dialogue from the film, but asking the live guide if it was them who killed the Witch of the East. After she threatens the riders, the guide asserts that the witch has no power here, and she better leave before someone drops a house on her too. She exclaims that she'll bide her time, but that she'll get you all and your little dog too, cackling as she disappears into another cloud of smoke. The guide asks the room what they should do next, and the Munchkins re-emerge, stating to follow the yellow brick road. They then burst out into the iconic song as the ride continues moving forward into the forest. Shortly, riders pass by a scene where Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Lion, the Tin Man, and Toto have arrived just outside of the Emerald City of Oz, which essentially concludes the ride before moving into a final larger room that shows a movie montage. While Disney built what I consider to be the best depiction of the iconic MGM film, Universal actually took this franchise in a completely different direction in 2006, opening the Land of Oz in Universal Studios Japan. Taking up a small amount of space, this mini-land combined the Munchkinland Village and the Emerald City of Oz, and walking around, you could meet the franchise's most iconic characters like the Scarecrow, the Lion, and the Tin Man. The land contained 3 attractions, which included the magical Oz Go Round, as well as a show called Toto and Friends, which rethemed the former Animal Actors building to fit in with the Wizard of Oz. I have no idea what the plot of the show is intended to be, but it features Dorothy and the Scarecrow, among other characters that may or may not be from the books. I'm inclined to say that these were probably made up for the show so that animal trainers could be on stage to guide the animals, but weirdly, there's actually no terrier to portray Toto, considering that his name is in the title. The third attraction of the land was Wicked, another stage show that is obviously based on the 2003 musical. I assume that this is the primary reason that the land was built, but this 30-minute show is an abbreviated version of the original, which makes sense, as I doubt that park guests would want to sit here for almost 3 hours. To be transparent, I know very little about the musical, but having just seen the movie, I know that it is split into 2 parts. Essentially, the Wicked show in Japan followed the songs and plots that the first film covers, also ending the performance with the piece Defying Gravity. The Land of Oz did not last very long, as it closed in 2011, but until recently, it was the only Oz-themed land that wasn't an entire park. In fact, in December of 2024, or just next month as of the making of this video, Warner Bros. Movie World in Gold Coast, Australia is supposed to open a land based on the MGM film. It's rather small, but contains 2 attractions, one of which is a Vekoma suspended family coaster known as Flight of the Wicked Witch, which twists around the haunted forest and the witch's castle. The other attraction is a pair of 2 Vekoma racing coasters, known collectively as Kansas Twister, which race each other around Dorothy's Kansas farm. It appears that the queues may have some indoor theming elements, or possible indoor guest areas with photo ops recreating locations from the film, but for being a land that's supposed to open next month, there's actually very little detail available on what else is there. I think it looks fine for some lightly themed coasters, but while it's the least immersive of the Oz attractions that I've highlighted, it still does fit into the theme of the video. So far, I've covered a fair number of attractions and even lands that bring the Wizard of Oz to life, but at one point, there were plans for an ambitious park that would have appropriately been located in Kansas. In the mid-1980s, the idea was pitched as the Wonderful World of Oz theme park and resort, which was likely sparked from the 1985 release of Return to Oz. After further organization, the Oz Resorts and Entertainment Company proposed plans throughout the 90s, which along with the park, included a hotel, shopping, dining, golf courses, and even a casino, which was unpopular with the Kansas legislature, which is ironic considering the lack of hesitation to anchor the entire MGM Grand around the classic film. There were many factors that prevented this project from happening, which included the company initially wanting to acquire the land in Wyandotte County, but had to fight with NASCAR for the property and ended up losing out. They then turned to Johnson County and the Sunflower Army ammunition plant, which was not only difficult to sell ownership of, as acquiring federal land comes with a lot of red tape, but the land itself was also highly contaminated with toxic chemicals from decades of production, which would have involved massive cleanup effort and cost. In addition, the development was met with resistance from the parent company of Worlds of Fun, which was located nearby just over the border from the planned site in Kansas City, Missouri. Local resistance also took the form of a group named Taxpayers Opposed to Oz, or TOTO, which resisted county money going towards feasibility studies for the park. There's a long, complicated series of legal and financial factors that never allowed this to be built, but its plans were originally conceptualized with Landmark Entertainment, with further development happening with the Goddard Group in the early aughts, so there is surviving concept art indicating what this would have been. It was actually set up in the hub and spoke design of a Disney castle park, and its version of Main Street would have been known as simply Kansas. In addition to horse-drawn carriages moving along the street, attractions would have included a museum dedicated to L. Frank Baum and the many depictions of the Wizard of Oz through the decades, as well as another attraction that covered the history of early electricity. At the end of the street, it split 2 ways, and on the right was Dorothy's Farm, which may have had a tornado simulator ride planned, as well as a petting zoo and some sort of small tractor flat ride for kids. Going left, park guests entered Professor Marvel's Traveling Fair, which would have included off-the-shelf flat rides, but also Wonders of the World, a show where you would view magical artifacts collected by the professor. The center of the park was anchored by the Emerald City, which was conceptualized as an indoor land with 3 floors. To get there from Kansas, park guests would either take a suspended balloon ride from the Traveling Fair, or would exit from the sepia-toned tornado simulator and emerge out in front of the city. If they chose not to split off to the sides of the land to experience these attractions, then they would instead cross a rainbow bridge into the Munchkinland Village and follow the Yellow Brick Road. This land, known as Munchkin Country, would contain a windmill flat ride, an indoor dark ride that chronicles Dorothy's journey, and a few other small attractions and entertainment that depicted the Munchkins celebrating the death of the Wicked Witch of the East. Following the road, this brought you to the eastern land of the park, which was known as Gillikin Country. This area would have been designed to look mostly like farmland, and there would have been attractions for notable characters. This included a corn maze for the Scarecrow, an aerial carousel for the Gump, a log flume for the Tin Man, and a mechanical gear teacup-style ride for TikTok, among many others. Finishing the road and emerging out near Emerald City, the outside contained poppy fields and some attractions, including the Horse of a Different Color carousel, and apparently another petting zoo. Inside the city, it was anchored by an e-ticket show where guests had a meeting with the wizard, and there was also a planned flight simulator similar to Soarin' that took you over the different regions of Oz. To the north of Emerald City, there was a snowy wonderland known as Quadling Country, which would have represented Glinda's domain. It would have included some small flat rides and an ice skating rink. The land to the west was Winky Country, which depicted the haunted forest and the witch's castle, with attractions including a suspended winged monkey roller coaster and a river rapids ride. In terms of what the park offered, I didn't cover everything, and I'm not sure how legitimate much of this information is, as it does come without source from the Disney Parks Wiki of all places, but actual concept art does seem to support these attractions for the most part. By the time the project was cancelled in the early aughts, especially with the massive tourism decline post 9/11, the budget was over $500 million, which even then seems like a low estimate for what this park would have likely cost at the scale that it was conceived. There were just too many factors fighting its unrealistic development, but it does seem like an actual park that, in scale, seems worthy of the Land of Oz. While the Wonderful World of Oz theme park seems like a lost project that will never be built, I can appreciate its ambition and also see the possibility of an actual land eventually coming to a park in the United States, but with a budget much larger than what is at Warner Bros. Movie World. In regard to Disney, other than the MGM Wizard of Oz scene in the Great Movie Ride, there was briefly a Return to Oz float in the Main Street Electrical Parade, but if Disney were to revisit the concept for a land or attraction, I doubt that this film would be used. That said, if things had panned out differently in early Disneyland history when incorporating the Oz books into the Disneyland show, I can certainly see Fantasyland getting a Wizard of Oz pretzel-style dark ride, which would have joined the other classics. There might be a world where people's favorite ride at Disneyland is not Peter Pan or Alice in Wonderland, but a strange adaptation of the Wizard of Oz stories without any animated movie to match. As recently as the early 2010s, legendary Imagineer Tony Baxter, who worked on many ambitious projects like Big Thunder Mountain, the original Journey into Imagination, and Splash Mountain, teased a possible Wizard of Oz land for expansion at Disneyland. While this space had many rumored lands and attractions developed for it over decades, including Tony Baxter's own Jules Verne-inspired Discovery Bay, the Land of Oz would be fitting too. If this truly was a serious project, it was likely cancelled after the underwhelming box office return of Oz the Great and Powerful, and with Disney's 2012 acquisition of Lucasfilm, this became the space where Galaxy's Edge is currently located. Do I think that Disney would be the one to pull off an Oz-themed land? All of the books are in the public domain, so they could certainly attempt it, but considering Disney's recent slate of half-baked and underwhelming lands and rides, I not only think that they wouldn't be interested because they don't have a relevant film, but I also don't think that what they could do would even be that interesting. I know that a lot of people think that I shill for Universal, even though I've criticized them quite extensively, but I actually think that this is the one company that would do Oz right, and with the budget needed for something ambitious. With the release of Wicked, a popular online sentiment is that with the level of ambition that we're seeing out of Epic Universe, Oz would actually be the perfect portal for an additional land in the future. Usually, I'm not a fan of park ideas that spread online because they're usually poorly thought out, with examples being Fast and Furious Supercharged extending the Wizarding World and becoming a night bus ride, or SpongeBob replacing Toon Lagoon. However, the rich world of Oz actually does lend itself to an entire immersive land, and with the crazy level of ambition from what Universal has shown from Epic, it truly does look like it's pushing theming standards forward in a rather dramatic way. While the park isn't open at the time of producing this video, so we'll have to reserve judgment to see if Epic lives up to its promises, it does seem like the rides will be expensive and ambitious, with the lands immersing you into dense, detailed worlds. With this said, what incentive would Universal have to consider Oz as a themed land? Well, obviously, Wicked is relatively popular, but I don't think it's a good reason to anchor a land, and I do have issues with its world building. For example, witches as depicted in the Oz books and even the MGM film are rooted in an older generation of American culture, which in my opinion is what makes that world so interesting. That American flavor of fantasy is what makes it distinct, but in Wicked, or at least in the film, an example of this departure is how Elphaba's pointed hat is contextualized as an old and ugly gift from Glinda's grandmother, passed on to Elphaba as a mean prank. Pointed witches' hats are traditionally derived from Quakers who traveled to and lived in North America in the 17th century, who often wore tall hats and were sometimes persecuted for being witches. The Witches of Oz have a cultural connection to colonial history and early American Halloween iconography, but when Wicked retcons this particular facet of the Wicked Witch's appearance, it removes the culture and becomes more generic contemporary fantasy. If a Land of Oz was built by Universal, I would have no problem with a Wicked stage show becoming an attraction like in the Osaka park, but I think the company would need to turn to the books to create a land and anchoring e-ticket ride that can exist as strong creative projects. I also want to throw out the thought that with the Simpsons contract expiring soon, I can also see a smaller Land of Oz still containing an ambitious ride replacing this area. Universal Studios Florida desperately needs better attractions, so this would be a good step in the right direction. Regardless of whether you agree that Universal should tackle this land, or perhaps another company like Disney or even someone else, the Land of Oz has promise that hasn't really been met. While I'm sure that the park in North Carolina is well loved, and many people miss the great movie ride and its Wizard of Oz scene, I don't think that the property has ever really reached the theme park heights that it seems to demand with its colorful world. Hopefully, this look back to the history of Wizard of Oz attractions was interesting, and while I don't want Wicked specifically to become the base for a new attraction or land, its popularity certainly reveals that Oz can be adapted into new ideas that resonate with many people. If you made it here to the end of the video and found it interesting, please go ahead and leave a like if you haven't already. As always, if you have not yet subscribed and hit the bell notification yet either, you can do so now to be alerted to new videos as they release.